Greetings, Guardians. This is Olympus Alliance. And today, we're not just talking about a hero. We're talking about understanding a hero. Because in Hero Wars Alliance, heroes are not just damage. They are systems, interactions, and most importantly, they are impact. And Sebastian is one of the best examples of that. At first glance, Sebastian looks simple. A support. Agility-based. Focused on critical hits. But if you stop there, you're missing everything that makes him special. Because Sebastian is not just increasing damage. He is redefining how damage works in your team. Let's slow this down and really understand what happens when Sebastian enters a fight. The first thing you need to understand about Sebastian is that he doesn't make your team stronger in a visible way. He makes your team more reliable. And that is far more valuable than raw damage. Because one of the biggest problems with physical teams is inconsistency. Sometimes you crit, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you burst, sometimes the enemy survives. And that small difference is what decides fights. Sebastian removes that uncertainty. When he starts buffing your team's critical hit chance, your damage stops being random and starts becoming predictable. And that's your first real tip when using Sebastian. He is not just increasing damage, he is stabilizing your damage output. And that alone is what allows aggressive teams to actually work consistently. But this is only half of the story. Because the moment those critical hits start happening more often, Sebastian turns them into something even more dangerous. Every critical hit now carries additional pure damage, and this is where his real value starts to show. This gives you your second major tip. Sebastian is one of the best answers against defensive teams. If your opponent relies on armor, on tankiness, on surviving through mitigation, Sebastian simply ignores that logic. Your team is no longer fighting through defense, it is bypassing it completely. And this is why you'll notice that teams that normally feel impossible to break suddenly become manageable when Sebastian is involved. Now, before the fight even develops, Sebastian is already creating pressure. With his curse, he reduces the armor of the nearest enemy right at the start. That means your first hits are already stronger, your first target is already weakened, and your team immediately gains momentum. And this leads into another very important tip. Sebastian is a tempo hero. He helps your team start strong, and in Hero Wars, starting strong often means controlling the entire fight. If you get ahead early, if you start applying pressure from the first seconds, your opponent doesn't get time to stabilize. And that's exactly what Sebastian enables. But damage and pressure are not enough if your team cannot act. And this is where most players underestimate one of his strongest tools. Because Sebastian doesn't just help your team deal damage. He makes sure your team actually gets to play. With his shield, he protects allies from stuns and curse effects. And this is huge, especially against control-heavy teams. Because what usually stops aggressive teams is not lack of damage. It's interruption. So here comes another key tip. Sebastian is one of the best anti-control supports in the game. If your team relies on attacking fast, chaining abilities, and maintaining pressure, you cannot afford to be stopped. And Sebastian makes sure that your heroes continue doing what they are supposed to do. Attacking, critting, and applying pressure. Now, once you understand these three layers, consistency, pure damage, and protection, you start seeing why he fits so perfectly with certain heroes. Take Yasmin, for example. She is already designed around speed and critical hits. But her biggest weakness is that sometimes she doesn't finish the job. Sometimes the target survives, sometimes armor slows her down. With Sebastian, that problem disappears. Her hits become consistent, and every critical hit carries pure damage, making her far more lethal. So the tip here is simple: if you want Yasmin to feel reliable and threatening in every fight, Sebastian is one of her best partners. Now look at Kayla. Kayla is all about diving into the enemy team and creating chaos in the middle of the fight. But her success depends on how much damage she can push through before being overwhelmed. With Sebastian, her entire damage profile changes. Her hits become critical more often, the damage gets amplified, and the pure damage ensures that even heavily defensive teams cannot fully resist her. So your next tip: Sebastian turns explosive heroes into finishing machines. Oya is another great example. She already combines critical hits with sustain, but struggles when facing high armor targets. With Sebastian, that limitation is gone. Because once again, you're not relying on armor penetration anymore. You're relying on pure damage. So Oya doesn't just survive longer. She actually becomes capable of breaking through defenses that would normally stop her. And this gives you another important insight: Sebastian doesn't just boost damage, he removes limitations from your heroes. And then we reach one of the most interesting synergies in the game. Who's? Because now you're combining critical hits, pure damage, and healing. Your team is constantly critting, Sebastian is adding pure damage to those hits, and Hus is converting that constant activity into sustain through golden feathers. So now your team is not just aggressive. It's self-sustaining. And this leads to one of the strongest tips in this entire guide: when you combine damage systems with sustain systems, fights become extremely hard to control for the opponent. At this point, you should start seeing the bigger picture. Sebastian is not just a support you add to increase numbers. He is a hero that changes how your entire team functions. He speeds up your damage. He stabilizes your output. He bypasses defenses. And he protects your team from being interrupted. But there is one final thing you need to understand to use him correctly. Sebastian needs the right environment. If your team is slow, if it doesn't rely on critical hits, if it doesn't attack frequently, you will not feel his full value. Because he doesn't create aggression from nothing. He amplifies what is already there. So your final tip is this: Sebastian belongs in teams that want to pressure, not in teams that want to survive. If your goal is to outlast the opponent, there are better options. But if your goal is to control the pace of the fight, to apply pressure constantly, and to force mistakes, Sebastian becomes one of the most valuable heroes you can use. And that brings us back to the beginning. Heroes are not just damage. They are impact. They are how your team behaves in battle. And when you understand Sebastian, you don't just see a support. You see a system that turns aggression into consistency. And consistency into victory. Stay tuned, stay sharp. And as always, salute and friendship.